At times like these, Noah Kincaid felt like he was George Bailey come to life. George Bailey, Jimmy Stewart, whoever, that loping, goofy, gangly guy from the movie It's a Wonderful Life. The one who dreamed big and lived small, and who, despite everything, never ended up leaving his podunk little hometown. Standing on the sun deck of his grandfather's cabin, looking down over the sloping, rock-strewn hillside and across the glistening waters of Cedar Lake to the town beyond that bore its name, Noah felt that familiar rock in his gut. That solid 10-pound hunk of granite, more like, hewn from the jagged outcroppings of rock that some Ice Age glacier had pulverized eons ago to form this pristine lake, and the idyllic little resort town beyond. Except it wasn't quite so idyllic. Not to Noah. To him, it felt like George's little town of Bedford Falls, beckoning, calling, luring him back into a life he didn't want. A life that was nowhere near wonderful. Well, okay, maybe that wasn't fair. It's not like he had a terrible life. He had friends, he had his twin sister, Paige. He was a paramedic and loved every second of it. And he'd even saved up enough money to do what George Bailey had never managed to do. Get away and see the world. To make a difference. Only 8 more weeks and he was off to Central America, volunteering with World Medic to help set up medical clinics in an earthquake-stricken region of Panama. His life was great, as a matter of fact. He was finally getting everything he'd always wanted for more years than he cared to remember. And yet, he braced his arms on the weathered cedar rail that surrounded the old cottage, noting that it could do with another coat of stain. He frowned, chipping off a small chunk of sodden wood with his thumbnail. Wet rot, he thought grimly. The whole railing should be replaced, this time with weather-treated lumber. It probably wouldn't take more than a weekend, and if he could get the guys from the station to help... There he went again, he admonished himself, pushing off from the railing and letting himself fall inelegantly into one of the Adirondack chairs that, truth be told, could also use a new coat of stain. No matter how often he tried to turn his mind to his upcoming trip, there was always something around this place that threatened to pull him back in and keep him grounded, keep him chained to the rocky ground of Cedar Lake, population 20,000 or so in the summer, 13,489 the rest of the year. Forever. He sighed and closed his eyes, enjoying the crispness in the air of this early June afternoon in spite of himself. This town wasn't a bad place. Far from it. When he'd been injured on the job in the city last year, home had been the only place he'd even considered going. Given the choice between some snore of an administrative job or going back on the road with Cedar Lake EMS, surrounded by people he had known his whole life, well, it had been the easiest choice he'd ever made. And he didn't regret it, even nearly a year later. It had been a good year, practically a vacation compared to the stress and violence of working ambulance in the city. But he could already feel the inevitable pull, that quiet, insistent lure of settling down here, that insidious little whisper that seemed to tug at him whenever he tried to imagine the life he always wanted. You're 30 years old now, kiddo. The very buildings seemed to taunt him as he drove his rig down the quiet midnight streets. Time to grow up. Time to settle down. Stop daydreaming and just be happy with what you've got. After all, you already have what most people spend their whole lives trying to find. Ain't it a wonderful friggin' life? He sat forward in the chair and propped his elbows on his knees. His head fell into his hands as that hunk of granite in his stomach all but knocked the wind out of him. 30. Good God, how was that even possible? Yesterday he had been 17. 17 and immortal. A new EMT with dreams of seeing the world, saving lives and rebuilding ruined ones. Brash and full of himself, not hard on the eyes if he did say so himself, a hit with the ladies, but never once tempted to settle down or sell out. Tall, fair-haired, possessed of a cheeky smile and an easy laugh, athletic and confident and on top of his little world. God, if someone had told that 17-year-old that at 30 he'd still be in the same little town, still working ambulance, still dreaming about bigger and better things. Well, he wasn't 30 yet, damn it. Not for 12 more hours, anyway. Hey, lazy bones. A familiar female voice made him glance up. His twin sister Paige was standing in the open sliding glass doorway, her eyebrows raised in almost comical annoyance. This party is for you too, you know. Can I get a little help? He stood up and ambled towards her, flashing her a winning grin, even though he knew he had no hope of placating her. She was probably the only woman he'd ever met who was completely immune to his charm. Maybe it was because she'd won the same genetic lottery that he had and was just as physically appealing as he was in her own softer, feminine way. Or maybe it was because, having grown up as his twin, she just knew him too damn well. She had seen his every move and learned his every trick, and absolutely nothing worked on her now. She blew an errant strand of her loose blonde curls out of her face and rubbed at her cheek with the back of her hand before planting her hands on her hips and glaring at him. What? He protested, all innocence. Can't I take a break on a beautiful day? You have to actually do work in order to take a break from it, she said, reaching for a broom and shoving it towards him. At least sweep out the dead leaves from inside the doorway here, okay? Your wish is my command, sister dearest, he said with Shakespearean flair. You have only but to ask. She arched her eyebrows at him again. Right, if only that were true. She turned and headed towards the kitchen. And don't do a half-assed job. When do I ever do a half-assed job? He called out in protest to her retreating back. Besides, I clean stuff all day long, you know. He began to sweep at the pale brown husks of what had once been leaves as they crunched and crumbled to powder beneath the bristles of the broom. I clean and disinfect the ambulance, I clean my gear, I launder the linens, Noah, I must have asked you 100 times to clean up this place for our party. I've been too busy at the bookstore, you know that. But did you get your ass up here and do as I asked? No, of course not. Her voice sailed through the air, seemingly happy enough with the sound of itself that she didn't require an answer from him. You're such a guy sometimes, I swear. Well, damn, he mumbled good-naturedly, stabbing at a desiccated leaf. No wonder you aren't married yet. Okay, that was wrong. He knew it even before she turned around and glared at him, her eyes two narrowed points of fury. But a smile gradually tugged at her lips, and he knew he wasn't going to die today after all. Well, not yet, at least. No wonder you're not married yet, she said pointedly, and probably never will be with a mouth like that. Amen to that. She rolled her eyes, literally rolled her eyes like a petulant teenager, and turned away. She continued through the lounge area of the cabin towards the kitchen, fluffing pillows and scooping up newspapers as she went. This cabin had been built with an open-concept layout about 50 years before the term even existed, a testament to their grandfather Ben Kincaid's vision. He hadn't liked the small, stuffy rooms of the Victorian-era homes he'd grown up in. He'd liked open spaces and an easy flow between functional areas of the living space. He'd only made 2 concessions to privacy. The bathroom had a locking door, and the 3 bedrooms were walled off from each other, each with their own door. But everything else in the cabin was open and spacious, filled with light from the large windows that overlooked the sun deck and the town further beyond the lake. So while the cabin had an old, earthy feel to it, while the appliances were vintage 1970s harvest gold color, and the plaid upholstery on the musty old furniture was equally eye-watering, the layout of the place made it feel much more modern and comfortable. Paige and Noah had spent many happy summers up here as kids, dashing through the place with melting freezies turning their hands red and orange and purple, reeking of anti-bug stuff and sunscreen, but mosquito-bitten and sunburnt anyway, living in their bathing suits for 2 months without so much as a t-shirt or a flip-flop to civilize them. And later, when they and their mom had been forced to leave the city and move back to Cedar Lake on their own, they'd all lived here for a few months while their mom recovered, while they all recovered, while they figured out how they were going to make it without their dad. That's when it had all started, he realized. That awful autumn night, when a routine traffic stop and a panicked driver with too many warrants had changed their lives forever. When suddenly, overnight, Noah was the man of the house. His grieving mother needed him. His shell-shocked sister needed him. 18 years old, and his life had been decided for him. All hopes of some future vagabond life had died that night, along with the father who had been more like his best friend than his dad. Noah finished sweeping and, checking to see that Paige wasn't watching, simply brushed the dead leaves out onto the sun deck and closed the door. Maybe the wind would scatter them. Whatever, at least they weren't still inside, and that's probably all she cared about. "So you're still going with the Bachelor for Life thing, then?" Paige asked him as he joined her in the kitchen. She was loading food into the old fridge. Hot dogs and hamburgers for the grill, beer and soda, salad and veggies with dip. He peeked into one of the unopened grocery bags and pulled out the potato chips and cheese puffs, tossing them on top of the fridge. "That's the plan." He aimed and sank a perfect three-pointer with the largest of the bags. "Yes, still got it." She said. "What, She looked at him, and he saw pale blue eyes so similar to his it almost made him start, like it always did. They weren't identical twins, naturally, but damn, it was obvious they were siblings. People always told him that his daughter would probably look just like Paige one day. The daughter he didn't have, that is, but whom the whole town figured was a foregone conclusion. After he found some sense and got himself a wife, of course, who was also a foregone conclusion, whenever he finally decided to straighten up and fly right. "I was just thinking that this is a milestone birthday for us, and sometimes people get to thinking about their lives at times like these." "Are you thinking about your life?" he asked, hoping to steer her away from the state of his love life, or lack thereof. "Of course," she said offhandedly. "But then I always do. I have my bookstore. I have ideas for the future. You, on the other hand, you don't seem to have any plan for your life beyond what you're going to have for dinner." Now he rolled his eyes. "Not this again. Please, Paige, as an extra special birthday present to me, can we not talk about how immature I am? How I need to settle down? Please?" Okay, it's just nothing," he cut her off. "You know perfectly well I have a plan, a good one, and I'm making it happen. 8 weeks from now, I'll be in Panama, and you know it. So enough with the lecture, okay?" "Look, I'm thrilled you're finally getting down there," she said, pausing to put a 6-pack of soda in the fridge. "Really, I am. I know you've wanted to do this since, well, forever, and I'm so proud of you for saving up and making it happen. She faltered. It's a 3-month volunteer gig, right? Or longer, if I want. Okay, so what happens when it's over? Have you thought about what you're going to do when you come back?" "I might not come back." He didn't let the words slip out. He was thankful for that, at least. But it was still shocking to him how easily they had flown into his mind. He hadn't told anyone, not even her, that he was thinking of extending his work with World Medic even longer, that he might take on other relief missions with them after his stint in Panama was over. World Medic was established all over the globe and always needed qualified, experienced help. The kind of help he could provide. The kind of expertise he had earned from nearly 15 years as a paramedic. He could see the world and do good work while he was at it. Paige was doing fine now, running the local bookshop in town, and their mom was happy living with her sister in Florida. Now he could finally take a deep breath and start to live. He had bigger dreams than even George Bailey's, and he was finally going to live them. Paige looked at him oddly, and by her expression he couldn't tell if it was just his lack of an answer to her question that had her concerned. She was doing it again, that infuriating twin WSP thing, as she called it. That way she had of being able to look right inside him and poke around in his most private thoughts. And she was doing it now, eyeing him with a kind of guarded suspicion. The next words out of her mouth were going to be, "You are coming back, right?" He just knew it. And it was a conversation he did not want to have with her. Not now, not on the eve of their big 30th birth weekend party. Probably not ever. "I don't know yet," he said offhandedly. I'll probably come back and work for another year or two, maybe take another volunteer vacation to somewhere different next time. I'll have to see how I like this one first. She didn't say anything, but her eyes never left his. She wasn't buying it. But if he could just duck out of this uncomfortable spot skillfully enough... "So who'd you invite to this shindig?" he asked. His face brightened. "Tell me you invited your high school friends, the ones you used to have up here for sleepovers." "Sleepovers?" She laughed. "God, that must have been, 14 or 15 years ago? You remember that?" "Of course I remember. Just the thought of 6 teenage girls up here in their little teddies and pajama tops." He wiped his forehead. "Whew! Enough to give a 16-year-old boy a raging... no, a headache." He smiled. She laughed. "Well, now that you mention it, at least a couple of them are coming." He rubbed his hands together gleefully. "Do tell." "You're awful, you know that?" "Why? Because I like women?" "Because you should know better at your age. You aren't 16 anymore, trying to score with whatever high school hottie you can convince to go parking with you." "Oh, come on. I never... In fact," she pointed a long, menacing finger at him, "if you start hitting on my friends tonight, I'm officially disowning you." "Now, hold on a minute," he protested, following her as she brushed past him and headed towards the bedrooms. "That is so not fair. I wouldn't tell you not to date my friends." "Oh, yes, you would. In fact, you have. You threatened to beat up Mike, what's-his-name, if he didn't back off. And you told Kevin Hastings that I had herpes. Thanks for that, by the way. He still looks at me funny when I see him in the grocery store." Okay, well, those are bad examples." He stifled a laugh as he remembered the conversation with Hastings. "I was a dick. Sorry. But it was years ago. You can't seriously expect me not to date single women in my own hometown just because you went to school with them." "The city's only 2 hours away, stud. Go hunting elsewhere." "Come on, Paige," he whined playfully. "Be reasonable. You want me to settle down, right? How am I supposed to do that if you won't let me near anyone?" She turned on him, flashing him a look that was almost anger. "If I thought for 1 minute that you were serious about that, I'd be the first to encourage you. But you aren't that kind of guy, and you know it. I don't want any of my friends getting their hearts broken over you. Lord knows you did enough of that in high school." "Really?" he started. He blinked, casting his mind back to the fresh young faces he had once pined over. "Like who?" She made a noise. Frustration, exasperation, defeat. She turned and kept walking towards the bedrooms. "Just keep it zipped, for my sake, okay?" "Keep what zipped?" "Mouth. Fly. Preferably both." She turned into one of the bedrooms, and he stood by the couch, lost in thought. Some of her friends in high school had been heartbroken by him? He searched his memory, trying to recall the girls he had dated. He didn't remember any of them being particularly close to Paige. In fact, Paige's closest friends had been brainy types, serious girls that looked down their noses at him, thought him too goofy and immature. Girls like Katie Malone. A sudden image of Katie Malone filled his mind, the way it often had over the past years. He didn't really know why. She didn't even live here anymore. She had moved to the city right after high school and had barely been back in town since. As a teenager, she had been quiet and kind of shy. She'd still pushed all his teenage buttons, of course, but she'd never been a typical hottie. Not that he cared. It was hard to be drawn to pure physical beauty when your twin sister was the high school homecoming queen, a part-time model, and the unofficial babe of Buchanan High. No, Katie had been more alluring than outright beautiful. She'd been pretty enough, but her hair, well, she had the thickest, glossiest, waviest chestnut hair he'd ever seen. Back in the day, it had stretched down to her waist, but she'd mostly worn it in one long braid down her back, denying the boys a glimpse of those heavenly tresses. She'd had such serious, velvety brown eyes, too, so wise and engaging, eyes that lit up the room when she smiled. He couldn't remember her smiling all that much, sadly. She'd lived with just her mom and hadn't ever known her dad, according to Paige, and more than a few times, had been sent to live with a foster family or vague relatives while her mom dealt with her own challenges. No one knew Katie's childhood hadn't been nearly as happy as his and his sister's. Maybe that's why she'd always struck him as such a serious, old soul type person. Someone who would never age because she'd never really been young. Or maybe it was just that Noah had always felt like a friggin' doofus next to her. So smart, so serious. Whenever she'd looked at him with those beautiful eyes, he'd felt about 2 feet tall. Sure as hell wasn't Katie Malone's heart he had broken. So why was he thinking about her again after all these years? Probably because of their birthday, he thought absently. She shared the exact same birthday as he and Paige, almost right down to the hour of birth. When they were little kids, it had been cute and convenient to celebrate their birthdays together, throwing big parties with all their classmates. And later, in their teen years, when Katie and Paige had become best friends, it had seemed natural to continue the tradition. Dinners and sleepovers. Come to think of it, Katie had spent a lot of time at their house. Maybe that's why he remembered her more than Paige's other friends. For a while there, it was like she was at their house every day. He'd heard someone mention that she was back in town, although he hadn't caught sight of her yet. For some reason, he hadn't wanted to ask Paige if it was true. Maybe it was just that he knew better than to ask her about a woman. Any woman. Judging by her reaction to his half-joking delight at the arrival of her friends, she wouldn't welcome his interest. But if Katie really was back in town, if she was one of the guests coming tonight, well, he could just be curious about an old friend, couldn't he? "Hey, Paige," he called out, aiming for as casual a tone as possible. "Speaking of high school, I heard, Katie Malone is back in town. Is that right?" Silence. He was about to call her name again when she appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed. "Yes, she is. And she's Kate now. She's not 16 anymore." He blinked. So it was true. She really was back. Now for the next question. Casual, Kincaid, for the love of God, keep it casual. "Is she coming tonight?" Paige narrowed her eyes at him. "Don't play all innocent with me, Noah. I don't want you getting any ideas about Kate." "What?" he asked, genuinely surprised. What do you mean? I was just curious. She was a friend of ours, and you know perfectly well what I mean. She's single now, and..." Paige paused and actually looked flustered, like she'd already given away too much. Just leave it alone, okay?" He held his hands up. I wasn't even thinking about it. But he was. The knowledge that she was here in Cedar Lake and coming over tonight was like a floodgate opening in his mind. Images of her, snippets of memories from their adolescence flashed into focus like he was watching a movie. She had always been serious, but there had been moments when she'd let her hair down, literally and figuratively, he thought. One night at one of Paige's sleepovers, he'd bumped into her outside the bathroom, all silly fleece pajamas and bunny slippers, and that hair spilling over her shoulders in a touchable cascade of pure silk that made him just itch to run a strand of it through his fingers. Blushes and excuse me's and an awkward quick getaway, and she was back inside Paige's room, but the memory of her, standing in his house, so frankly, openly comfortable, like she belonged there. And now she was coming here. He shook away the thought. They'd known each other for nearly 20 years, and nothing had ever happened between them, not even once. Not even close to once. And nothing would happen now. Katie had never been interested in him. It was as simple as that. She'd spent a lot of time around that other guy. What was his name? Jeffrey Lucas. Mucus Lucas, that unbelievable nerd with the sinus condition. She'd always seemed most comfortable around egghead types like him, the kind who had retirement savings plans at 18 and 3 degrees from Harvard by 25. In other words, the exact opposite of big, brash EMT types who'd never gone to college and wanted to travel the world, even as 30 was closing in. Didn't matter anyway, he told himself. She wasn't his type either. She'd bawled like a baby when they'd watched It's a Wonderful Life that one Christmas, crying real tears in the end when George ran up the stairs, knocked the loose newel post off and kissed it, and when all those kids had leapt on him and nearly suffocated him. Noah had wanted to cry too, but for altogether different reasons. Poor George, sucked back into domestic hell and convinced that it was what he had wanted after all, not the adventurous life that had been stolen from him by his family and his town and by God himself. George had sacrificed everything for everyone else his whole life, when all he'd ever wanted was to see the world. In the end, he just wound up like everyone else in that one stoplight town, working at his father's savings and loan, saddled with a wife and a bunch of kids, and a ramshackle old heap of a house. Katie had friggin' loved that movie, and that was all that had to be said about that. Besides, he wasn't hanging around anyway. 8 more weeks and he was free. He couldn't care less what Katie Malone was doing back here or why she was single now or anything. He had better things to think about, like Panama. Gorgeous weather, gorgeous scenery, gorgeous women, a chance to do some real good, to work hard and help bring health and prosperity to another corner of the world. Anyone could get married and have kids. Everyone did, as a matter of fact, like rabbits, reproducing on cue without a thought in the world. That was not going to be him. Paige was watching him, and he squirmed under the laser precision of her gaze. She moistened her lips and spoke carefully. Well, I'm glad you're not thinking about it, because, trust me, Kate is not in a place right now to benefit from anything you have to offer. He raised his own eyebrows at her imperiously. Is that so? Trust me. Paige faltered, hesitating. She wanted to tell him something, clearly, but was fighting herself. She's not looking for... Hey, it's cool, he said, holding up his hands. Like I said, not interested. I was just curious. Well, just make sure you stay not interested, Paige warned. She deserves better than you. Damn, she could stick the knife in but good when she wanted to. She didn't even know she'd done it, he could tell by her face, but it had still felt like a blade slicing right in, a feeling he was all too familiar with. She deserves better than you. He wasn't a player, for God's sake. He didn't have a different woman every week. He hadn't even had a girlfriend since he'd moved back here. He'd only been on 3 dates. They had all ended with a chaste goodnight kiss and no interest on either side. Thanks, sis. I love you too, he managed. You know what I mean, Noah. She softened, obviously having caught the flash of hurt on his face. Look, I'm sorry, but you know what you're like. And you're leaving anyway. It's better that you don't get involved, right? Right, he nodded. You don't have to worry about me and Katie. Kate, whatever. Great, Paige smiled. Then, with a bright sigh that pretty much announced, let's change the subject, she gestured towards the bedroom behind her. Can I get your help with the bunk bed real quick? I just want to do a quick tidy of my old room. Her room, he snorted inwardly. Her room, right? Ownership of this room had been an ongoing battle between them throughout their childhood. It was the coziest room in the whole place, both the warmest in winter and the coolest in summer, with the best morning light, and, of course, the most comfortable bed. Well, the bottom bunk, at least. The top bunk was a medieval torture device, but the bottom mattress was one of the most comfortable he'd ever slept on, which is why he had fought her tooth and nail for possession of her room for most of their adolescence. Funny that you still call it your room, he mused, following her in. Don't start, she said. I thought we settled this years ago. Not hardly. You painted it pink one summer and declared it yours. And then you put up Goo Goo Dolls posters and locked me out with a chair against the door handle. He laughed, remembering. That's right. Whatever happened to those posters? I burnt them all next summer, when I reclaimed possession of my room. He was glad to banter with her again, glad to settle back into their familiar sniping and griping. It was comfortable, and it was tinged with affection. I just need your muscles to help move this bed out from the wall, she said, surveying the small room once they were both inside. Light streamed in and warmed the wood floors with a soft orange glow. I haven't slept under there in ages. I bet there's dust bunnies the size of Chryslers under there. I don't think anyone will care, he said, scrunching up his face. I care, she said. Kate, someone is staying over and might want to bunk in here. Kate is staying over? Noah? Okay, never mind, he protested. This is me, not interested. Where do you want the bed? Just out from the wall. He grasped the hand-tooled cedar posts of the bunk bed and tested their stability. The frame was still solid, even after all these years, and it took more force than he thought to shift it away from the wall. At first it barely budged, and he felt a surge of embarrassment. He was a paramedic, after all. He lifted people on gurneys every day. He pulled people out of cars. He carried obese patients up and down staircases. He should be able to shift one lousy bunk bed. Paige stepped forward to help him, and he silently accepted the help, glad it was just his sister watching and not a real girl. How embarrassing would that be? With her help, the bed skittered across the wood floor with heavy, ponderous thunks until one end of it angled away sharply, and the other remained tucked in the corner. Paige was about to maneuver herself closer to the other end when the phone trilled from the living room. "I should get that," she said, slipping past him and out of the room. "Let the machine get it," he said, not relishing the idea of moving the bed the rest of the way by himself. "Somebody might be lost," she called. "Some people are coming in from out of town." So he stood there, rendered mute by a sneeze that threatened and finally exploded, teased out of him by the disturbed dust of 30 years. He was staring down at the floor, waiting to see if another sneeze would erupt from him, when he spotted it. There, in the far corner, standing on end up against the wall. Frowning, he slid himself the wall towards the corner and leaned down to get a better look. It was dark and dusty back there, but when he leaned down further to touch the object, he knew immediately what it was. A diary. A girlish, pink diary with a little brass lock and everything. He looked at it for a long moment, turning it over in his hands, wiping away years of dust and grime. The little tarnished lock was broken, and so he carefully pried open the stiff, water-damaged pages, feeling the spine crack as he did. God, this thing had to be decades old, he thought, flipping carefully through the pages and prying apart a few that had stuck together. The girlish blue handwriting, faded and almost transparent in some spots, flowed across the top of each page with the flowery abundance of youth. He was about to keep flipping when his eyes locked on 2 particular lines at the top of one earmarked page. "And I could have died when I saw him dancing with her." With her? I mean, of all people, of all the girls in school, he chose to dance with her? I mean, seriously, I was standing right there, but I might as well have been invisible. Oh, there was a God, Noah thought gleefully, his heart beginning to beat faster. This was the score of the century. His sister's long-forgotten teenage diary. This would be sweet, his inner devil calculated quickly. Tonight, around the fire pit with all their friends surrounding them, he would bring out this little gem and start reading all the juicy passages aloud. He could already picture her shrieks of horror as she tackled him and fought him for possession of the treasure, even as all their friends howled with laughter. Oh, it would be glorious. He heard her coming back down the hall and quickly closed the diary. He slid it into the back of his jeans and let his shirt fall over it just as she came back in the room. "That was Lily and Carl," she said, almost breathlessly. "They're about half-hour out. Wanted to know if there was anything they could pick up. I didn't expect them quite so early. I guess we better..." What are you grinning at?" "Nothing," he said, schooling his features into as much innocence as he could muster. She narrowed her eyes at him. "I know you. What is it?" He held up his hands. "Nothing. Just remembering the battles over this room." The phone rang again, and she sighed. "Here we go," she said. "I guess the party's starting whether we're ready for it or not." "You want me to just leave the bed here?" he called out as she went back for the phone. "Yeah, just put it back. The dust bunnies get to live another day," she called and answered the phone with a cheerful hello. With a Herculean shove, he pushed the bunk bed back against the wall and checked to make sure the diary was still tucked safely in the back of his waistband. He peeked out into the hallway, and seeing Paige chatting brightly on the phone, he nipped across the hall into the cabin's other main-floor bedroom and quietly closed the door behind him. There had to be some juicy stuff he could embarrass her with, he thought. He wouldn't read anything really personal. He did love his sister, after all, but there had to be something he could use. Something to get back at her for her casual cruelty, her sisterly disdain for him, his choices, and pretty much everything about him. for thinking Katie Malone could do so much better than him, and telling him so. He sat on the small room's single bed and thumbed through the diary, charmed in spite of himself by the large, loopy, girlish script. This was like a time capsule, he thought, or a time machine, a glimpse of his sister before she grew up and opened her bookstore and became so damn judgmental about his love life. Maybe he'd be able to find some tidbits about her love life back then. He thumbed through the pages and read isolated entries. Trouble with teachers, anxiety about grades, arguments with their mom, typical teenage angst, none of which was particularly interesting. No, he was looking for the good stuff. Boys, crushes, desperate teenage passion and declarations of undying love. Then his eyes snagged on one page and he read, "I saw him in the hallway today and was so frazzled I dropped my books. Everyone laughed, but he just helped me pick them up and he called me a klutz, but in a nice way. I was so embarrassed. It's crazy. I know he would never be interested in me, but I just can't stop thinking about him. I dream about him." Oh, this is good, Noah thought with devilish delight. Wouldn't it be fantastic if this guy she had been gaga over was someone they still knew? Someone who would be here tonight? He kept reading. "I know Lily thinks it's because he's so good looking, and I'll admit that doesn't hurt, but he makes me laugh. He's so funny. But not in a mean way, not like other guys. He's sort of, I don't know, gentle." Noah snorted. Gentle. Girl code for complete pussy. "And he has a nice way about him. Like there's more to him than meets the eye. I really like talking to him. I see him all the time, but I can never get up the nerve to talk to him the way I really want. Lily says I should just jump his bones one day, just throw him up against the wall and kiss the life out of him. Not say anything, just kiss him, like he's never been kissed before in his whole life. And that's what I dream about doing. Or actually, that's what I dream about him doing to me. God, that would be so cool. If he just strode up to me, all fire and desire, and put his hands on me and pushed me up against that wall and kissed me without saying a word. Or just kissed me in some other totally unexpected way when we were just goofing around or something. Oh my God, I'd be so his." Noah let his head fall back, feeling a slight pang of guilt over invading his sister's privacy like this. Oh, to hell with it. This was just too damn good. He had to find out who this stud was, this Lothario who had turned her into a wanton nympho like that. No 16-year-old boy on the planet had moves like the ones she had wanted. No boy that age had the confidence or the skill to pull off a grope like that. But the fact that she thought this guy, whoever he was, had been capable of such sexual prowess, well, it was charming and actually kind of sweet. He could almost feel the tender, fledgling feelings of this young woman through the pages, this love-struck young girl feeling the first blush of puppy love. He'd always known Paige was romantic, but he'd had no idea she was this flowery about it, or that she had been so bowled over by someone in high school. I mean, who was this dude, anyway? It couldn't have been Callum Barnes, the local cop who had been so totally, absurdly in love with Paige in high school that the yearbook committee had voted him most likely to become Mrs. Paige Kincaid. She'd never returned his feelings, at least not that Noah could tell. He flipped ahead 2 pages. "Mom used to say she knew my dad was the one for her in high school, and I believe it. Sometimes you just know, and I just know, too. Maybe he'll look back at this in 50 years and laugh, having been married to him forever and the mother of his kids." Noah frowned slightly. Hadn't their parents met when their dad had pulled their mom over for a broken taillight? It had been the stuff of family legend. She'd flirted with him to get out of a ticket and ended up marrying him a year later. Or maybe that's just what had led to their first date, he thought, casting back through his memory. They had gone to the same high school here in Cedar Lake, so maybe Mom had had her eye on him long before that conveniently broken light. Jeez, now he wasn't sure of anything. Paige was good at this kind of family stuff. He was lucky he even remembered her birthday, and that was only because they were twins. He turned back to the page. But who am I kidding? Like he'd ever marry me. He doesn't even want to stick around this place. He tells everyone who'll listen how he's going to get the heck out of here the minute he can. I bet the minute he turns 18, he'll be on the first bus out of here. A strange, warm feeling began to tingle through him, and it wasn't pleasant. He could feel his frown deepening into a deep furrow, and without knowing exactly why, his stomach began to flutter with apprehension. He'll move on and forget he ever even knew my name. I won't forget his, though. It's not bad enough that he has to be funny and smart and tall and gorgeous and sexy. He has to have such a beautiful name, too. Noah James Kincaid. Noah froze. His heart pounded at the sight of his own name in that girlish, bright blue script, penmanship that suddenly looked completely unfamiliar and so unlike Paige's. He flipped to the front of the diary with trembling hands, his heart starting to beat faster. He thumbed to the first page and stared at the words. Diary of Katie Mae Malone. Private and confidential. Keep.